Morning, everybody. How are we doing today? One of jazz's most unheralded guys, I think, is Art Farmer. If you're a Miles Davis guy, if you're a Chet Baker guy, Art Farmer's probably going to be right in your wheelhouse. He's got that same mid-tempo to down-tempo color and feel. He plays ballads beautifully with a mute beautifully. He's probably better at high tempos than Miles or even Chet Baker. You know, he's a very diverse player, very agile. He's got cleaner tone than Miles. He's really underappreciated. And some of his records go for pretty good money. You know, his Prestige days go for pretty good bucks. This is early Art, which came out on New Jazz. And it was stuff from 54, 55, if I recall. So there's a few different sessions. Yeah, 54. It's a great assignment on this. Wynton Kelly, Addison Farmer, Kenny Clark, Percy Heath, Horace Silver, Sonny Rollins is on 4 tracks. But he's just a very agile, thoughtful player that kind of goes under the radar with a lot of collectors today. And again, he didn't have a large Blue Note body of work, which always seems to be held against a guy today, just in terms of their notoriety and their legacy. Being on Blue Note just gives you this leg up because people are so informed of that hip word, and so people want to dive into Blue Note, so they'll buy anything they can find with Blue Note on it, not even knowing the history of the context. Oh, I got this Blue Note, boom. And it gives you this kind of club membership credibility thing, which is great. But I think, myself included, you missed a lot of other parts of the jazz chapters that were on different labels because it didn't have that same pedigree or head-turning value. And that's one of the things my channel has always tried to be, is an ambassador for a lot of the great jazz that's between the cracks. A lot of the great jazz that happens in those days that kind of goes uncredited. I want to pose a question to my viewers. Again, race, we talked about a little bit at the beginning of the last episode. My friend Ken, he's had some issues on this group, Facebook. People just being very argumentative about some of the things that we share as we try to advocate for the black roots of this music. And this has multifaceted dimensions to it. But in your mind, in the comments, let me know, who are the most collectible white jazz musicians? And that is going to be an interesting piece of insight when you look at it. I'll give you my 3, maybe even 5. And there's only a handful that collect at good money. And there's multifaceted to that. Part of it's white records sold better, so there's more distribution, more are still available. But outside of Bill Evans, Chet Baker, and Art Pepper, with an honorable mention to Stan Getz, and I believe Jerry Mulligan belongs in this conversation, but Mulligan's records go for $4 or $5. You know, those 5 to me are probably the names that are the most loudest ringing out for the great white horn players. Who are the great white legends that fetch high collector dollars, are highly in demand, that all the collectors want? Aside from, like I said, Chet, Evans, and Art. I'm not even as high as on Art Pepper as some people are. I've learned to appreciate Pepper more. I certainly have always been a big Bill Evans guy. And Chet Baker, there's like I said, on a rainy day, Chet Baker's a fantastic thing. With your morning croissant and a cup of coffee and half a squint in your eye, some Chet Baker will help you force open that hangover. You know, Baker's got that kind of thing going on. I'm not going to go any further on that. Just what do you think? What in your opinion are the most collectible white jazz artists? And that's not a reflection of ability. It's just a reflection of where today's 2020 hindsight has shifted the market, and also, again, supply and demand is a part of that as well. But and a lot of the obscurest black artists from the 50s and 60s have become very collectible and very hip and chic. And again, some of that's also just the marketplace creating a demand. So it doesn't really have a lot of meaning aside from that it's interesting. You know, so what are your most collectible white jazz artists? Who do you think? You know, and again, we're talking mostly 40s, 50s, 60s. You know, I don't want to get into the Pat Metheny's who sold a ton of records. You know, Keith Jarrett's, those guys sold a lot of records. Different era, different audience. Not my expertise. And honestly, Keith Jarrett records, I see them all the time for $5. So anyway, let's move on. Today I want to talk about, not just in real quick summing over, about how many records I have from each label that are my top labels. And we're not going to include the major four, Capitol, Columbia, Decca, and RCA. Their sequences that their jazz releases come in are filled with all kinds of other titles as well. So to sit and count and dissect what was jazz, what wasn't, so much of it's very kind of milky pop jazz, you know, a lot of vocal jazz on those labels. I think I have probably 40 Decca up to probably 200 and some Columbia, but we're not going to count those four. And I don't even have a good count on my RC and my Capitol right now. They're probably both around 100 records that are pretty jazz relatable. But so the top 12 jazz labels in my collection in terms of how many albums do I got. And a couple of ground rules are we're not counting 7 inches. We're not going to count double copies of a record. If it comes out in 2 different places with 2 different covers with 2 different numbers, I'll probably count those both because they have 2 different places to be highlighted and crossed off. But I won't count anything that's just another copy of the same record, or I got an original copy and I also have an OJC. I'm not going to count any of that stuff. And with some of the labels, there's quite a few where I have doubles in that sense, where I'm like, oh, I find an old one for a decent price and I filled in the old one. So let's, without any further ado, let's count them down. We're doing 12. However, I want to give you an honorable mention of 8. So it's going to be 20 in a way, but we're just going to run through these bottom 8 real quick. At number 20 is the Dawn label. I have 25 of the 27 titles. The 2 I don't have are compilations that are borrowed from their sister label, parent label, Seco, and aren't even really jazz. One's kind of like polka music, and the other one I think is like a rock and roll early thing compilation. Neither of them are jazz from what I've heard and seen. So I have pretty much the whole Dawn label at 25. And there's a few there I have multiple pressings of as well, not counting those. VJ, I'm at 31. And 31 is the bulk of the VJ jazz discography. And it's a pretty good discography. You know, when that 3000 series gets going, there's some great titles in there. Wayne Shorter, Lee Morgan, Wynton Kelly, solid stuff. But it was a short run, and I think the success of the Beatles really changed their focus. Paul Chambers' 2 records on VJ are great. Awesome record by Louis Hayes. Some good stuff. But so VJ, number 31 and 19. At number 18 is United Artists, where I have 34 they're kind of sprinkled in weird places. I might have missed a couple. United Artists was a film giant. They started a record label for their soundtracks, and then they ended up starting a jazz department. There's actually 2 sequences, like a 5000 sequence, and then there's that number, the black and white covers. I can't remember what that sequence is right now. But so there's 2 different sequences. The one's definitely jazz. The other one's kind of got a mixture. They're not one of the preeminent jazz labels, but there's some great titles. 34 United Artists. ABC, the parent label to Impulse, and before Impulse was created in the late 1960, ABC released all the jazz titles on that imprint from 55 to 1960, late in the year. Even after that, the more R&B side of the jazz stuff, jazz soul, stayed with ABC. The more experimental jazz went to Impulse. I have 54 ABC titles. There's some really great stuff in there, and then there's some white cats that you've never heard of that are good musicians. A lot of filler. That's, like I said, it's good music, but you'll never hear of it. There's no demand for it, and they sell for a few bucks a piece. I'll fill them in when I'm buying stuff, just like, oh, that's not part of the history, you know. So that's part of what I'm doing, is trying to fill those histories in, just so I can know them and speak on them as fluently as possible. 61, Jubilee. Jubilee is a fun label Herb Emerson was affiliated with Atlantic early on. He ends up going his own way. There are a few Jubilee 10 inches out there. I only think I have one, a Polly Bergen, who was a famous actress, ended up in The Sopranos actually for one episode. She's a decent singer. It's a nice little record. Great cover. I believe it's a Burt Goldblatt. But the Jubilee label is a kind of hodgepodge, and their sister label also does like comedy stuff. So you want the 1000 sequence up to 1105 or so. And of the 105 records, there's probably 40, 50 really serious jazz records in there. A lot of kind of really forgotten stuff. And around 1050, 1055 or so, they start really going to pretty ladies on the covers. And a lot of those covers are worth having just for the cheesecake factor, you know. And then you listen to the record, like, and again, you can't record in a studio in 1950 and not be a great player. So they're always great players. It's just, again, we speak from different places. So Jubilee's at 61. The Roos label, and this includes 18 of their 22 10-inch releases. Roos right now is at 69. I have pretty much the entire 12-inch 2200 sequence, and I think I'm missing 4 of the 10-inch right now that have been tough for me to track down. No, 6 actually. I have 18 of the 24. So Roos is at 69. Great label. It's the first label that I've mentioned where their jazz royalty Roost is. You know, Don's a great label. Other labels kind of have a mix and match, but Roost really focused on great black jazz artists. Of course, Johnny the Smith, the great guitar player, was the heart and soul of the label, and he's white. Then number 14 it will be is Fantasy. Fantasy's out of San Francisco in the Bay, the Weiss brothers. Dave Brubeck was part of the creation of the label initially, and then he was discouraged when he found out he didn't really own as much as he thought he did, so he ended up moving on to Columbia with the business falling out. Cal Jader's a big part of the Fantasy label, and Fantasy, of course, ends up having big success in the 60s with Creedence Clearwater Revival. As they're doing that, they're buying up labels that are of jazz nature that are going extinct, and Fantasy is the power behind the OJC series in the 80s that under one umbrella has Contemporary, Prestige, Riverside, New Jazz, Jazzland, Debut. All those great labels were lumped together under the OJC title. And so Fantasy, that stuff is of very importance, of course, but we don't count that as the Fantasy. We count Fantasy stuff of the 50s into the early 60s, and then they're still doing some cool jazz titles with like Kenny Burrell in the 70s, and I think there's a Cannonball Adderley record that's really great in the 70s, but they kind of switched their focus to rock, and then the OJC was the resurgence of jazz. And then number 13, and this one's the closest to being at 100 without being at 100, that's Contemporary. I have 95 Contemporary 10 inches and 12 inches. I'm looking to complete the 3500 series. I think I have about 8 titles left to go in that. And then once it gets into 3600, it really skims out. I don't have a lot of that stuff yet. I'll get there at some point. I do have 4 Contemporaries coming in the mail, so I'm almost at 100 with Contemporary. So let's move on. Number 12 on my list, CTI. And I lumped CTI with Kudu, which was their sister kind of more soul jazz label, R&B sides, Grover Washington, that kind of stuff. And I have 101 CTI Kudu records, and they're fun stuff to DJ. It's really well produced, really well packaged and presented. I haven't bought a CTI Kudu record in a long time. I have almost everything at CTI. There's a few of the A&M CTI that I haven't got yet, and I want to find eventually, including a Milton Nascimento record, a Brazilian guy that I've never come across that, but I haven't bought a CTI in a long time. This one's stuck at 101 for probably a year and a half maybe. Number 11 on my list at 124 is World Pacific Records, which it's both. And Pacific has 3 sequences, and they all are jazz inflected. The 1200 sequence kind of coincides with the mid to late 50s. There's a 10-inch series before that, which I have a number of titles in that as well. A lot of that was reissued in the 1200 sequence. Then there's a 400 series that's only 12 titles, about 59, 58, which I don't really know why they started that. Then they switched the name to World Pacific, repackage it, have a new kind of look to it, and they start off at PJ1 and go into a couple hundred before they change again the look and the sequence. And so of Pacific, which is a label I really love more than I remember I do. Whenever I dig it, I'm like, man, there's some good stuff here. But Pacific's at 124. Number 10 on my list. One of my favorite labels. The packaging is incredible. The artwork's really beautiful. They have a short blast of a run where they made a pretty big impact, and then they fade off quickly, and that's Bethlehem. I have the whole 10-inch series. I have the whole BCP series, and I have all but one of the 6,000 series. So I'm at 178 Bethlehems with one to go, and there's also some compilations out there that if I found cheap, I'd buy them, but I pretty much have all the original material on the Bethlehem label at 178. At 184, number 9 on my list is Savoy, and that includes 10 inches, and that includes 12,000 sequence up to about 12,160. And then after that, there's a sprinkling of titles like Cozy Cole and Herbie Man. There's a few things that kind of sprinkle in, and then there's some stereo reissues also that come in the 12,200s. But for the most part, I'm focused on that first 5-6 years of Savoy, 12,000 sequence, and the 10-inch stuff, and then 184 Savoys. And that was a long time to build that. It's hard to find Savoy originals, but a lot of them aren't that expensive. Another label that I don't buy much anymore, but I have the first 150 plus 39 more titles after that is Impulse. So I have pretty much all the first 10 years of Impulse up to number 150, and then after that it's pretty hit and miss for me. Even by the late 120s, 130s, there's a lot of stuff in there that I don't really ever go back and listen to. You know, Impulse is a great label, beautifully packaged, a wide range of sounds. There's no Impulse sound. People want to think there is, but there's not. It's a really diverse label with a lot of different things going on. And of course, Bob Thiel takes over from Creed Taylor early 61, maybe late 61, and that change also kind of switches the direction of the label somewhat. Thiel was definitely a musicologist, and Creed Taylor was more of a production and manufacturer of packaged music. Impulse is fantastic. There's just not a lot of titles I'm looking for, so it's been stuck at 189 for a long time. Number 7 on my list is the Emerson Mercury family, and I have quite a few 10 inches there. The Emerson 36,000 series is fantastic. I have everything up to about 124, 36124, and then the next 45 records or so, I'm missing maybe a dozen. Once we get to 1960, 61, Emerson gets faded out then. So I have in total about 150 Emerson, including my 10 inches. And then the rest of that stuff is Mercury jazz titles, which again, Mercury is not exclusively a jazz label, even though Emerson, they're the parent of Emerson. Emerson just means Mercury Record Company, MRC. But Mercury had a whole lot of different things on their sequence, the 20,000 sequence. There's all kinds of pop, soundtracks, R&B, jazz, and eventually they phase Emerson out, and all the jazz that's remaining goes back to Mercury. A lot of Quincy Jones stuff was on Mercury. He starts off at Emerson. So there's a crossover there. Some stuff gets released on both, but the Emerson stuff still is the gold. That's the early days, the wonderful peeling artwork. I love old Emersons. They're always worth having. Never pass up on old Emerson. They're never that expensive. It's part of the Midwest, Chicago legacy, man. It's great stuff. Number 6 on my list is Argo. Argo, aka Cadet, which was under the parentage of Chess label, Phil Leonard Chess in Chicago. The Argo imprint was launched in 1956, late 55. The first one's Al Hibbler, fantastic. It was actually called Martari on the first album, and then it switches to Argo on the next album. I'm not sure why. I have copies of both. I've never seen the Martari Hibbler one before. I was so fascinated by it, and it's a combination of one of the Chess brothers' sons, if I recall, Mark and Terry, maybe Martari. I can't remember exactly that information, but Argo's a great label, full of Chicago blues-inflected soul jazz, organ jazz. Some cats like Sonny Stitt There's just a lot of great records that fill up that lineup at Argo. And like I said, I have all of the first 150 Argo minus that one Caesar Giannovini record, which I talked about a few episodes ago in my most wanted records. I need that one Argo. I want to have it. I need that one Bethlehem. I want to have it. It just finishes off the story. I have all the chapters and I see the scope of what they were about. And it's good to read the whole book. It's good to know the whole story if you can. And a lot of these labels, a lot of the titles are easy to fill in. They're not that expensive. Once you start getting past a certain point, there's a lot of Argos and Emersons you can find for $5. And they're great stuff. You know what I mean? Number 5 on my list is Atlantic. And this is exclusively Atlantic 1200 series. The 8000 series at Atlantic's much more blues, R&B, pop. And a lot of it's fused together. Ray Charles and Aretha Franklin, and there's a lot of stuff that's just real mixed together. Elements of the blues, elements of soul, elements of R&B, elements of early rock and roll. And so that 8000 series is a whole different beast. If I was to include the 8000 series, I'd have to go into my R&B room and count all my R&B Atlantics, which I'm not going to do. And I don't feel that they're jazz. They're on that sequence for a reason. So there's some crossover. Some 1200 artists get a few 8000 releases and vice versa. But for the most part, they don't have dual releases. That Clover's record is one of the few that does. But so Atlantic's 284 of the 1200 sequence, and that 1200 sequence runs from 1200 through 1600 or so. And my focus has been on the first 300 or so. And like I said, I probably have about 250 of the first 300. And a lot of what I don't have there is also going to be collections and compilations and stuff, which Atlantic does quite a few of. There's only a few titles in Atlantic I really want to find at this point. So 284 at Atlantic. Number 4 is the Riverside Jazzland family, Warren Keep News and Bill Grauer. I'm a huge Riverside guy. Of these top 3 New York labels, Blue Note, Prestige, Riverside, Riverside's your best value. And the sessions are more consistent than at Prestige. You're going to get a more focused album than a lot of what the Prestige albums are. A lot of the Prestige albums are kind of culled from different sessions, different sidemen around different sessions. Riverside seems to take more care to make sure that a record has the same sidemen from similar sessions that had similar feels. The albums feel much more carefully packaged versus some of the stitched together stuff you get at Prestige. Great players, Monk, Adderley, Bill Evans. So many great artists, honestly, are on the Riverside imprint. And it's something I've almost finished. There's a few New Orleans revivalist compilation records that came out where they were finding old Dixieland guys and gals and reissuing or re-recording some of these lost, forgotten artists that they put into the main Riverside sequence, which I wish they would have given another sequence. Riverside also has a few other sub-imprints like Battle, as well as Jazzland, which is a whole other 100 records. And Jazzland was initially going to be kind of a budget reissue thing, but then they eventually put a lot of the more edgier stuff on Jazzland. But even that's not that well defined, But there's certainly some really experimental, interesting stuff. European players, Swedish players, UK players, that Jazzland issues that weren't necessarily going to be on the Riverside imprint. And of course, Bill Grauer ends up passing away, and the label was bankrupt, unknown to Warren Keep News, and Riverside folds its doors in '63. But from '55 to '63, Riverside's body of work is absolutely immaculate. And there's some cool 10 inches as well, although they tend to be more in the Dixieland tradition. There is some cool modern stuff that comes in there as well. So Riverside's at 380. Number 3 on my list at 469 is the Verve Clef Norgran family. And it's mostly Verve. I've only started recently collecting the old Clefs and Norgrans when I see them. I figured early on I just wanted to get the Verve versions of a lot of this stuff just for clarity's sake and continuity's sake. But as I've seen some of the old Clef stuff, I've been buying it. But be warned, a lot of the early Clef Norgran stuff is reissued numerous times in the 8000 regular Verve series. In fact, the first 200 titles in the Verve sequence 8,000 through 8,200 or so. It's pretty much all Clef Norgran stuff with a few newer titles sprinkled in there. But it's such a huge body of work Norman Granz puts together by a lot of the legends, you know. And as a DJ, I collected a lot of the 60s Verve, Creed Taylor, the Gatefolds, the kind of loungy cocktail jazz, and that stuff's awesome for what it is. It's great to entertain and eat pineapple ham chunks too. But the real beautiful early Verve non-gatefolds, pre-8350 or so, that stuff is all the legends, the Eldridges, the Coleman Hawkins, the Lester Youngs, the Dizzy Gillespies, the Sweets Edisons, Count Basie's. Ella Fitzgerald, of course, has her own sequence as well, which is part of that number. So 469 Verve, and that one's still got quite a lot of room to grow. You know, unlike most of the other labels that bring you to the top here, they're mostly filled in. A title or two I'm looking for. With Verve, there's still hundreds of records out there. Probably a 24 Ella records in the 4000 series I don't have yet. There's probably about halfway through the 8300 sequence. I probably have about 40 of the 8200 sequence, and probably about 35 of each 8000, 8100 sequence. So there's a lot of titles to fill in there. Some of it's kind of redundant. Some of it gets reissued later in the 8000 series. So I try to pick and choose what I'm looking for. And I certainly am going to go for more of the big name Eldridges and Sweets Edisons and those guys, or some of the more obscure stuff. But even like Norman Simmons and Buddy DeFranco, it's great stuff. You know, and I keep learning all the time as I digest and buy this early Verve stuff. Some of it's not that expensive. Some of it's becoming more and more expensive. It's fairly well distributed and available. Some of it's being reissued now, but I'll be collecting Verve for another few years at least, to probably get close to 800 eventually. But as of right now, I'm at 469, and that's number 3 on my list. Number 2 on my list is Blue Note, and this was the first one that went giant. You know, I'm at 482 Blue Notes, and that might not include a few tone poets that I might not have written down in my book. Blue Note, it was such a giant body of work. It seemed so immense when I first started really buying into jazz in 2004, 2005, 2006. But as I filled that stuff in, and I already had some Blue Notes like Blue Train and something else going back to the late 90s. But as I was getting into the early thousands, I started having 50, 60 Blue Notes. And then you start having enough of those sequence numbers where you're like, oh, I kind of want to hear all those Mobley, Morgan, Dorham, you know what I mean? And Donaldson. You just get sucked in. And like baseball cards, they have those damn numbers on the front. You know, the little note with the 4,106 in it. And you're like, I want 4,107. I need to check it off on my checklist. And of course, me being a collector, being obsessive compulsive, which is of course a large part of why my collection looks and is how it is. You know, genius is sometimes a byproduct of obsession. And that's me, boy. Blue Note 482, and that includes 2 different 10-inch sequences. You know, the one that's more modern, the one that's kind of Dixieland, Sidney Bechet kind of stuff. And that includes the 1500, 4000 sequence, and then of course some tone poets, some Japanese stuff, some 80s. There's a lot of Blue Note stuff even after the sale. But my main body of the focus is that Alfred Lion, Frank Wolf, LP era stuff, which I have all of that. And anything that was recorded in that era that gets released later, I'm always looking to fill those titles in. And I have probably 80% of that stuff, you know, but there's still, I don't have Curtain Call Hank Mobley yet. There's probably 4 Jackie McLeans I don't have yet. There's a few Grant Greens I don't have yet. You know, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that can be plugged in that was unofficially never released, but it's still part of that Blue Note legacy. And as Tonepo puts it out, or as I find it, I'll grab it. So Blue Note 482, and that leaves number 1, Prestige 547. And they're the behemoth of the New York labels. They stayed around longer than Blue Note or Riverside by a long shot. They have the new jazz imprint, where there's about 100 titles there. There's the 7,000 sequence where there's about 800 titles. There's the earlier 10-inch material, which I don't have a lot of that stuff, honestly, but most prestige 10-inch stuff has been issued in the 12,000 and 7,000 sequence on the 12-inch, so I haven't really been looking to buy prestige 10 inches a lot. There's also Moodsville and Swingsville, which both have 25, 30 some titles on them, which are great traditional jazz stuff on prestige. So prestige has a lot of different kind of umbrellas under which they house things, but it's all prestige. And so the number's at 547, and that's including pretty much completed all the 7,000 through about 7,350, and then from 7,350 to 7,600, there's probably another 150 titles there, and after 7,600 it really thins out. By that time we're into the 70s, and they're still putting on some cool stuff, but it hasn't been my focus, and I fill out stuff when I see it for cheap, you know. But so prestige number one at 547. What label do you have the most by? You know what I mean? What label do you most want to fill in all their stuff? Every one of these labels has a title or two I'm looking for. You know, Impulse and CTR are probably the two I've done the least looking for in the last 2 years. I don't look for Riverside too often or Blue Note too often. For Blue Note, now I'm kind of just waiting for Tone Pool to release titles that I want. Prestige, I rarely look for I haven't looked for new jazz stuff. So there's some stuff that I'm still trying to fill in. But I really look for prestige. I mostly just, when I'm in a store and I'm going to buy a few things from my guy anyway, I'll type prestige into the search and I'll see what they have. And if there's a few old Houston Person records, you know, or some Johnny Hammond Smith, just that late 60s, early, you know, I'll buy that stuff when I see it for the right price. And of course, Prestige is also notorious for repackaging their own titles, which I've said many times. So you can end up buying the same Sonny Rollins, Monk, Modern Jazz Quartet. A lot of that stuff gets issued 3-4 different titles, different covers, different numbers, so it can easily be fooled. So again, 547, number one, Prestige. It's a lot of records by those 20 labels, and that does include those 4 majors. And then there's literally dozens of small labels out there where, as I'm learning, and some of them are even hard to find discography lists for, but that's part of, I think, my job here as a shepherd, is to kind of collect these lost herds and flock them together and help me understand the overall mosaic, that each label's narrative is a part of the overall picture. And then, of course, there's the European labels, where I am pretty ignorant of. I have some Vogue, I have some ECM, I have some Steeplechase. Not a lot in any of those, you know, not a lot. Black Lion, I got some European stuff, but a lot of the European stuff from the European labels seems to be more mid-60s forward. And you don't see a lot of 50s, early 60s European records here in America. Shipping from Europe is always a little bit daunting.